Welcome to Weather Extra. I'm First Alert Meteorologist Jillian Johnson. Last week, we flipped the calendar from September to October, and we kick off this week's episode by looking back at what last month brought us here in Central Texas. Here's First Alert Meteorologist Sean Bellafury with the September recap.
If you're anything like me, on October 1st, you start to blare "Wake Me Up" when September ends, and it is time to wake up. But summer hasn't yet passed, and rain isn't coming just yet. So taking a look back at September, that was lots of hot temperatures during the afternoon, a lot of 90s out there, and even a triple digit on the 4th. But we only had an average high of 92 degrees, which is 1.2 degrees above the monthly average. And thanks to some cool mornings in the beginning and the end of the month, our average low was only 0.2 degrees above that monthly average. The problem in September came from rainfall. We did total a little over 2.5 inches of rain, which is only about 1/3 of an inch below average, but we only had 4 out of 30 days with a trace of rainfall. Now, because of the hot weather in September, we're now starting to see a flash drought emerge across central and south central Texas. Not a big increase in the drought monitor, but abnormally dry conditions are starting to return, and boy, could we use some rain. I do want to talk one thing in September, and that is hurricane season this year. We had 3 hurricanes form, including 2 major hurricanes, Gabrielle and Umberto. But September is the month where we have the most tropical systems in the Atlantic. And with only 3 forming in the month of September, that is actually 3rd place, tied for 3rd for tropical cyclones forming in September since 2000. Reporting in the studio, Sean Bellafury, KWTX News 10.
Thanks, Sean. We're now in the early days of October, and you may be wondering what's in store for us this month. First Alert Meteorologist Brendan Jackson has the outlook.
We are more than a week past the start of fall at this point, and so far we've been sitting right around average temperatures for this time of the year and haven't seen much of any rainfall. As we move into the month of October, let's take a look at what we can expect our climate to be here in Central Texas. We typically see a drop of around 10 degrees over the course of October, going from an average high of 86 early in the month to an average high of 75 by the end. Highs above 100 have happened but are uncommon, and we have even seen days in October where temperatures did not get above 40. We also see that same drop in our average lows over the course of the month, with typical overnight temperatures falling into the lower 50s by the end. We have also seen lows not get out of the 80s, as well as lows well below freezing. Warmer air is forecast to dominate much of the lower 48, save for a belt closer to average temperatures across much of the plains. We are right at the southern end of that belt, so the expectation is slightly warmer than average, but not to the extent that could be seen both east and west of us. October is also our second rainiest month of the year, averaging 4.41 inches of rain over its course, only trailing May by 0.03 of an inch. Historically, we have reached well over a foot of rain on occasion, and even had one year without seeing a single drop. We've even seen snow in October, but only once. In terms of rainfall, normal amounts are expected across a good portion of the nation, save for the Pacific Northwest and Florida. But across our region, drier conditions are expected to dominate for much of the month. So, in short, October is a month with a lot of variability, but at least for now, the start of the month seems very consistent, so it will be interesting to see how things change in the coming weeks. For KWTX, I'm First Alert Meteorologist Brendan Jackson.
Over the past 2 weeks, 2 tropical systems, Imelda and Umberto, were spinning off the Atlantic coast. These 2 storms came very close to one another, allowing Umberto to influence the path of Imelda, preventing the storm from making landfall along the east coast. Last week, we were watching to see if a rare phenomenon known as the Fujiwara effect would take place. First Alert Meteorologist C.D. Finley now joins us to explain what that is.
If you pay any attention to hurricanes, you have probably heard of the Fujiwara effect. But what is it? The Fujiwara effect is a rare meteorological phenomenon named for the meteorologist who discovered it, Sakuhei Fujiwara. First documented in 1921, the Fujiwara effect is when 2 cyclones interact with each other. For this to occur, each cyclone must be within at least 900 miles of the other. If the cyclones are of equal strength, they will rotate around a common center between them. If one cyclone is weaker than the other, then the stronger cyclone will influence the path of the weaker one. So why do we bring this up? Well, it's expected that the Fujiwara effect will play out with 2 cyclones in the Atlantic, Imelda, located near the east coast of Florida, and Humberto, located over the open Atlantic Ocean. Humberto, which was a Category 5 hurricane at its peak, is expected to influence the path of the much weaker Imelda, pulling it away from the east coast of the United States and back back over the open ocean. So if you were wondering what's happening with Imelda and Humberto, now you know. It is just a scientific effect that was discovered over 100 years ago. For KWTX, I'm First Alert Meteorologist C.D. Finley.
September 26 marked a year since Hurricane Helene made landfall in Florida as a powerful Category 4 storm. Helene would carve a path of destruction across not only Florida but much of the southeast, like in Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and eventually further north in the U.S. The storm caused around $80 billion in damage and over 250 individuals lost their lives, making Helene one of the deadliest and costliest hurricanes in recent U.S. history. Now, the mountains of western North Carolina were some of the hardest hit areas. More than 1,000 bridges were destroyed or damaged, and homes floated away off their foundations and right down rivers. Dave Malkoff, who covered that storm, went back to check on the effort to rebuild these communities 1 year later.
Now, you'll see my house when we start down this road.
We first met Jeff Hughes last winter. He's the guy who builds handmade caskets deep in the mountains that were hit by Helene. When the storm took out his personal bridge, he was forced to detour with his caskets just to access the main road.
You know, you had a long trip to take it out. You're walking backward across the river on a walk bridge.
A year later, things look different. With help from volunteers, Hughes now has a new bridge.
It's so much easier now just to back up and load it up and take it straight on and not have to load it and unload it.
How do you feel walking across this bridge now?
You know, I feel fine.
It's just good enough until the next flood, which are common in these mountains. But getting a permanent bridge?
We're in the mercy of the state, I understand now. We're on the list, so we don't know how far down the list we are.
Just downstream, 5 families still have to do this, drive through moving water just to get home.
We still feel like we're exactly where we were September 27th, 2024. So, because we haven't seen anything come in from the state or FEMA to actually put a bridge back.
Robin Ollis and her team of volunteers built this footbridge for the families here. But she says the community can't shoulder this burden alone.
Get the funding here and the contractors to build these bridges, period.
One reason for the delay are these narrow switchback roads where she lives. And rebuilding the bridges takes giant tools and trucks that are easier to move around a larger city like Asheville.
Whereas this rail car bridge is going to take us about 2 to 3 weeks.
Chris Warner runs a North Carolina state program that's putting in this new bridge. Funds from the state are covering the construction costs for this and many other bridges.
When we first started reporting this story a year ago, that was not the case. They were being told that if there's a bridge that's out on your property, that is your problem.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, you know, the way it was. But I'm just very happy that leadership in our state stepped up and came up with a solution to help them out.
FEMA does offer money for private bridges, but it's far less than what the state is providing. A year after Helene,
We'll get back to normal one of these days.
what endures is more than the damage. It's the resolve of a mountain community that refuses to be washed away. For Eye on America, Dave Malkoff in Newland, North Carolina.
Welcome back to Weather Extra. I'm sure you've heard of hurricane hunters, the group of men and women who fly into tropical storms or hurricanes to collect critical data to help better forecast these storms. First Alert meteorologist Brendan Jackson has more on the importance of their job and how they keep us safe as storms head our way.
When forecasting the tracks and intensity of hurricanes, the National Hurricane Center uses forecast models extensively. But these models need current observation data to perform well, something that is hard to come by in the open ocean. The mission of collecting this critical data falls on the hurricane hunters of the U.S. Air Force and the NOAA, who fly airplanes into hurricanes to collect this data from different parts of the storm.
We're gathering wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity, and pressure levels at the flight level as we're making continuous crossing pattern through the storm. And then we're also releasing instruments from the plane with what's called a drop sonde. We release it from the plane all the way down to the sea surface, and it's capturing that same data all the way down to the surface level.
Flying through hurricanes to collect this data is just about as intense as it seems.
The plane will just kind of be flying along, and then you hit, kind of a 0G where basically you're just flying straight up, and then you can slam back down again and back up and back down until you get through the worst of it.
The forecast track created by the National Hurricane Center for these storms, better known as the Cone of Uncertainty, has shown an improvement in accuracy with the addition of Hurricane Hunter data.
I've seen some studies recently, as much as it seems to have reduced the size of the cone by 20 to 30%.
This improvement leads to more efficient evacuation orders for those in harm's way. For KWTX, I'm First Alert meteorologist Brendan Jackson.
Well, you just heard about the job of a hurricane hunter, but now the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association has deployed a new gadget to help monitor storms. The new first line of storm defense is floating out in the sea as NOAA has dispatched a new fleet of drone boats to gather tropical storm and hurricane data. CBS News meteorologist Scotty Withers was able to talk with the woman behind this idea.
NOAA is working with Ocean to deploy this fleet of 5 small robotic drone ships across the Caribbean.
So they're each 100 miles apart, and they're kind of acting as a barrier so that as a hurricane comes in and potentially threatens the United States, these sea stars can hopefully collect live data on the hurricane as it's coming in.
Unlike old-fashioned stationary buoys, these high-tech drone boats called sea stars can motor directly into the eye of the storm.
They've all got their propellers on right now to give them basically the ability to sprint as fast as possible towards the oncoming weather event.
For decades, Hurricane Hunter planes have flown into the storms, sending back critical data. But NOAA has not been able to get real-time water surface information.
One of the things that we don't know a lot about is how much basically the hurricane sucks energy from the ocean to fuel itself and become more powerful.
The first real-world test just happened. This sea star dove right into Hurricane Gabrielle,
which essentially should help us be able to forecast the track of the hurricane, the intensity of the hurricane better. And then in the kind of long term as well, the high resolution data should help the scientists kind of better predict how these things form and intensify in the first place.
The bicycle-sized boats are built to survive. The one that sailed into Gabrielle was dealing with 15-foot waves and devastating winds. Even if a storm damages one of the boats, it would still send back the data.
Individual sea stars are quite low cost. We should be able to deploy like 50 of these out there. So instead of getting like one data point from within the hurricane, you can actually get multiple data points from different parts of the system, which is much better if you're trying to figure out what's going on.
Ocean has 2 more standing by to deploy into the Gulf if it looks like a tropical storm or hurricane starts to develop there. I'm Next Weather meteorologist Scotty Withers, CBS News, Miami.
Coming up next on Weather Extra, we learn more on the impact the increase in seaweed has had on sea turtle hatchlings as they move them from their nest into the ocean. We have more on this research after the break. Welcome back to Weather Extra. In this week's Degrees of Science, we speak with the researcher from Florida Atlantic University who's been studying the increase in seaweed along the tropical beaches of the Gulf Coast and Caribbean to find out the impact it's had on sea turtle hatchlings.
Dr. Milton, thanks for joining us. I guess off the top, for people who may not know, what is sargassum?
Sargassum is the main seaweed that grows in the Atlantic, sort of in the North Atlantic gyre. So a lot of people have probably heard about the Sargasso Sea, and that is sort of the kind of puddle that gets caught up in the gyre, and it's full of a lot of this floating algae. But it is being produced in greater amounts lately, and a lot of it is now washing up on our shores, both in Florida and across the Caribbean.
So this is something that's natural, but we're seeing a lot more of it. Is it a bad or positive impacts that it could have on the area beaches?
Like everything, there's going to be both positives and negatives. I mean, it definitely can bring some stability to the shoreline in the sense of protecting the actual sand from erosion, say in a storm. It brings nutrients to the beach, and there's usually a lot of invertebrates like little shrimp and bugs and things that get caught up in it. And so you'll often see a lot of birds feeding in the sargassum looking for all of those tasty little bites. But once it's been on the beach for a day or two, it does start to stink, and it can grow into huge piles that are unsightly for sure for tourism.
So you're focused on turtles. Now, what species of turtles were y'all focusing on for your research?
So we actually looked at the 3 different species that nest most commonly on our Florida beaches, and those are the loggerhead sea turtle, which we have many, many of those that nest here, green sea turtles, which also nest in fairly high numbers, and then also leatherbacks, which are the most endangered, and we have the fewest of those, but still a few thousand every year.
So you were focusing on kind of that period from when they hatch to when they get into the ocean. Now, I love this part because I didn't know this term, the frenzy phase that these little hatchlings go through. What is going on during that phase?
So if you can imagine the sea turtles, they sort of erupt. We actually call it a boiling. So they all come scrambling out of their nest at once, hopefully at night. And then they race down across the beach and into the ocean. And then they basically swim for 24 hours without stopping. And that we think that the whole goal of that is to get them across the beach, which is very dangerous. Lots of predators will hang around and snatch the baby turtles as they're crossing the beach. And then there are also plenty of fish that see them as edible as well when they get into the ocean.
What kind of method did y'all use to try to test to see what kind of impact this sargassum would have on these hatchlings?
So we actually made a sort of a little runway down the beach with black plastic, basically a few inches high, that we would make a 15-meter runway with, and then the first 13 meters of that were just sand like the turtle would be crossing normally. And then the last 2 meters we had a low pile of sargassum that went for the 2 meters, and then a slightly higher pile of sargassum. So we would time how long it took them to run across the sand and then across the sargassum. And then we did a few physiology studies at the end of that. So we tested their glucose levels to see if they were expending a lot of sugar to do this. And we also looked, basically put them in a bucket upside down and timed how long it took them to flip back over, because that would mimic what happens in the ocean. Of course, when they get into these waves, they're being washed all over the place because they're very tiny little turtles compared to the size of the waves.
So what kind of results did y'all end up finding with this research?
We found it didn't actually seem to bother them too much physiologically, in the sense that the glucose levels weren't wildly different. They didn't seem to be super tired, so they didn't have any problem flipping back over in the water. But it did take them much longer to cross the sargassum than it takes them to run across the sand, which isn't too surprising, but some of them it took quite a bit longer. Many of them had trouble actually climbing up onto the sargassum. You know, we had it at about a 45-degree angle. We had one that flipped over 20 times trying to climb up. He would get partway up and then fall on his back and have to flip over, and crawl partway up and fall on his back and have to go back up again. It just takes so much longer. That leaves them much more vulnerable to predators, or, you know, they might get stuck in the sargassum entirely and, you know, be out there in the morning when the sun comes up. So then they're at risk of overheating and dehydrating.
Moving forward, what is it that we can do to help out with this?
It's always going to be a sort of a double-edged sword, because you think, oh, well, the obvious thing is just to rake up all the sargassum, but which is what we do here in Florida for the most part, because we rely so heavy on tourism and, you know, just people that live along the beach. They don't want these huge stinking masses of rotting seaweed on their beaches, which is understandable. But like I said, it does bring in nutrients. It is, you know, a food supply. It does help stabilize the beach. So you don't just want to necessarily always rake it up all of the time on the assumption that it's bad for sea turtles, because it's good for other things, right? So there has to be some kind of a balance between, you know, getting rid of these massive piles that are clearly, you know, turtles aren't going to get across and people are going to hate, and, you know, leaving some of the seaweed on the beach for, you know, the benefits that it does provide to the ecosystem.
To hear more about this research and Brady's full Degrees of Science interview, scan the QR code on your screen to watch on YouTube, or go over to our website at KWTX.com/Degrees of Science. Weather Extra will be right back. Welcome back to Weather Extra. NASA has officially selected its new class of astronaut candidates for this year. The 10 American men and women were introduced to the public back in late September. They were selected out of a pool of 8,000 applicants to train for 2 years for future space missions to the moon and eventually to Mars. As part of their training, NASA says the astronaut candidates will conduct simulated spacewalks and fly high-performance jets, among other things. Now, introducing this new class of candidates is another step in NASA's race to return to the moon before attempting that unprecedented crewed mission to Mars. Ivan Rodriguez has the latest on NASA's upcoming missions.
NASA is aiming to make another giant leap for mankind by sending a crewed mission to the moon and eventually to Mars.
Some of you may take humanity's first steps on the red planet of Mars. All of you will carry forward missions that today exist only in our dreams. But together, we're going to make these dreams a reality.
Artemis 2, a test mission that will fly around the moon, is planned to launch no later than April 2026, according to NASA, and is intended to help confirm the systems and hardware needed for deep space exploration by humans.
We are going back to the moon to establish a sustained presence. The crew there on the surface of the moon will be trying to figure out how to live off the land.
Even though the 4 astronauts for that mission have already been chosen, some of the crew members headed to Mars in the future could include any of NASA's 10 newest astronauts introduced on Monday. Among the candidates are former military, a geologist, and mechanical, aerospace, and biomedical engineers.
With upcoming exploration missions, we are pushing the boundaries of human performance. And the lessons that we learn are going to help us to excel not just in space, but in areas of human health here on Earth.
During their 2-year training, the astronauts will learn about NASA's history and vision for the future, and will take classes in geology and in water survival and space health. Upon completion, the new class will join the 48 other members of the space agency's astronaut corps and become eligible for flight assignments.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of Weather Extra. We'll see you again next weekend. Have a great week.